have historically funded them principally, if not exclusively, from general revenues, which is among the reasons why they're having so many fiscal problems today. That they're financing. There's no perfect solution to this. There's no financing scheme that's universally recognized to be perfect. And among the reasons Greece, for example, has so many problems today is because this constitutes a statutory claim. They're the way they finance their welfare programs on general government revenues. We did it differently. We started out deliberately to do it differently, thanks not least of all to what Francis Perkins called the prejudices of our people. So our system has some pluses and some minuses, but there it is.
Just one other thing, sort of obvious, but the demographic profile of the Western European nations and us right behind them is also changing. These are in some fashion schemes that are predicated on the notion that there are more people coming in underneath people who are beneficiaries. And as people have fewer children and as people live longer, I don't care how you finance them, all of these programs are in very, very serious, in serious jeopardy.
Kennedy, could you talk a little bit about FDR, I guess it was pulling back some of the stimulus programs in 1937 and how things kind of took a dive, and then maybe parallel that with today, what's your opinions on what you think if the stimulus is pulled back?
Yeah, did we repeat that mistake?
Everybody get the question? About fiscal policy in 1936-37 and the so-called Roosevelt recession, the sharp second downturn in economic activity, stock valuation, and so on, 1937. Well, a little bit of background. Let's not forget that John Maynard Keynes did not publish the general theory of employment, interest, and money until 1936. Okay, so before 1936, there is no systematic economic rationale for deficit spending as a stimulus measure. The concept was not completely, people didn't fail to understand it. In fact, Herbert Hoover, when he was Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s, advocated creating what we today, I suppose, call a rainy day fund to be used for construction projects as in the downswings of the business cycle to offset them. It's called counter-cyclical spending. So the concept wasn't entirely novel, but a systematic, high-grade, theoretical economic justification for doing this didn't exist until 1936. Okay, so it's in that context that Roosevelt puts together his 1930 fiscal year 1937 budget. He's still in the thrall of orthodox economic thinking to a large degree. He thinks deficits are bad. In fact, he used to call the deficits he ran in 33, 34, 35, and 36. He refused to call deficits. He said the regular budget is in balance. We have this thing called an emergency budget, and that's where the deficits are. There's no such thing. It was just a complete fiction, a kind of political cover, but it registers his unwillingness to embrace deficit spending as a deliberate policy tool. Okay, it was justified on the basis of relief and alleviating human suffering, but not as a stimulus package the way we would understand it today. So, 1936, again, go back to his inaugural address in January of 1937. He thought the Depression was ending, unemployment was coming down, production was going up. It's time to get the whole budget, emergency and regular, back in balance. There's actually another local or short-run factor here. Over his veto, the Congress in 1936 had passed the so-called bonus bill. Remember the bonus marchers that marched on Washington, D.C. in 1932 when Herbert Hoover and Douglas MacArthur burned them out of Anacostia Flats, and Hoover suffered all kinds of political damage for that. They were World War I veterans demanding the premature early payment of a bonus that had been guaranteed them to be paid, I believe, in 1945, as it happens. And they wanted it early, and Hoover wouldn't give it to them, and Roosevelt didn't want to give it to him either because he thought it would be a budget-busting deal, and he vetoed the bill. And Congress passed it over his veto, and that added about $1 billion to the federal budget in 1936, and that stimulated the economy, we now think, and helped bring that unemployment rate down to 14%. But Roosevelt was determined to make up for that and to begin pulling in his budgetary horns and return to fiscal orthodoxy. So he shrank the federal budget in 1937 markedly from the prior year, and guess what? Unemployment went up again into the 20% range, and the stock market took another nosedive, and GDP went down, and so on. And it's then, in that context, that a group of younger economists, and especially a young fellow in the Treasury Department by the name of Laughlin Curry, who had by this time read the brand new book by John Maynard Keynes on the general theory of employment, interest, and money, they came around and said, look, we need a deficit not just to alleviate short-term suffering, but there's a rationale, there's a justification for doing this as a way to refloat the economy long-term. And this guy Keynes has laid it out how we're supposed to do it. So how about it, Mr. President? He agrees at that time, for the first time, as I said earlier this morning, on the grounds of doing this for deliberate, targeted reasons of economic stimulus. He agrees to a $3 billion deficit in fiscal year 1938, and indeed that starts to refloat the economy again. So it's writers today like Paul Krugman and Reed love that little bit of history because it seems to be a really concrete and unarguable example of what happens if you withdraw federal stimulus and then reintroduce it, and the results, according to that point of view, are absolutely predictable.
You talk about the psychological effects of the of the depression and everything. Has there ever been a book research done on the psychological effect of the New Deal on the people, considering that people got jobs, did all this stuff? What was the psychological effect on them, on the country itself?
Well, to be honest, I don't know of a study that's as targeted and focused on the psychological effects of the New Deal as Mira Komorowski's study is focused and targeted on the psychological effects of the Depression. But I can give you some anecdotal evidence that maybe contributes to an answer. And again, I'll just tell you a little story about this. We all know about the fireside chats, Roosevelt's radio addresses to the American people, done in the most informal of settings from the White House, but people heard them in their living rooms. He didn't get in front of the Congress to do these. Surprisingly, there were only 30 of these over 12 years. People think there's a lot more, but there weren't that many. But his very first one was given on the first Sunday that he was in office, the end of his first week in office, on a Sunday evening. So this would be approximately March 8th, 9th, 10th, 1933. He's inaugurated March 4th. And he goes on the radio to announce that thanks to this emergency legislation that's just passed, the banks are going to reopen. Every bank in the country essentially was closed for the end of the prior week. Talk about a gloomy atmosphere in which to be inaugurated, my God. So he goes on the radio to announce that the bank's going to reopen. And it's the first fireside chat. It's a brand new way for the president to communicate with the American people. Radio as a technology was then about a dozen years old, but no political figure had really figured out how to use it very effectively. Harding and Coolidge spoke on the radio, so did Herbert Hoover. But Roosevelt's the first person who really realizes the possibilities of this medium, especially its capacity to speak intimately with the people in their homes instead of ex cathedra in some way. So he gives this address. In the following week, now I forget the exact numbers, but I'll get the orders of magnitude right. In the following week after this address, something like 500,000 letters came into the White House from ordinary citizens out there in the world. I've seen some of these letters. They're at the Hyde Park Library, and they're written on butcher paper and school tablets, and the spelling is often very original. A lot of them are blotted with food stains and all the rest of it. Spelling, as I say, is often quite quirky. They're letters from ordinary citizens, just ordinary Joes and Jills. The White House mailroom had to hire, again, I forget the exact numbers, but I'll get it approximately right. I think it was 40 people to handle this volume of traffic. The White House mailroom had exactly one person in Herbert Hoover's administration to handle unsolicited mail from the citizens. Now they had to hire 40 people, and that level of correspondence with the president continued throughout the 1930s. Now there's something mysterious happened here, and we all recognize, people who study this all acknowledge it, but nobody can really explain it. But it's in the realm of psychological reaction. Franklin Roosevelt, somehow or other, touched this chord in the public and managed to create a personal relationship with people that eludes most, if not virtually all, political leaders. I mean, it's a real mystery how he pulled that off. And there's a follow-on story to this, that when he died, in 1945, and you've probably, many of you, seen films of the funeral cortege in Washington and so on. And there's a story attached to that moment when some person was weeping on the street of Washington, D.C. as the funeral procession went by. And somebody said, oh, said to this person who's weeping, oh, you're obviously very moved by the president's death. Did you know him? And the person replied, no, but he knew me. It wasn't the same person, but another person also said once that Franklin Roosevelt is the only president we've ever had who understands that my boss is a son of a bitch. But again, just further anecdotage, but there's something mysterious in there about his ability to touch so many people so deeply and so intimately that people felt like they were known by the president. That's something given to very few political leaders, I think. Larry.